Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Richard Brennan. Richard's an Alexander Technique teacher, author, and the director of training at the Alexander Technique Center based in Galway, Ireland. And we're going to talk today about an incident that happened in November of 1946 at 16 Ashley Place, and what its implications are for Alexander Technique directing. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Robert.
I'm going to begin. I know this is a quote, and this is a quote that comes from Walter Carrington's book, A Time to Remember. And I know that you've been thinking a lot about this, and I wasn't actually familiar with the quote until you sent it to me, but it's a topic that I've been thinking about a lot as well. So I think I'm going to start by reading it. It's a paragraph long, and then we're going to discuss its implications. So here is the quote. On Monday, the 4th of November, 1946, during the tea break at 16 Ashley Place in London, Alexander said that he had at last decided that we cut out, in the future, teaching all instructions to order the neck to relax or to be free, because such orders only lead to other forms of doing. If a person is stiffening their neck, the remedy is to get them to stop projecting the messages that are bringing about this condition, and not to project messages to counteract the effects of the other messages. So all orders in future were to be framed so as to emphasize non-doing. So I guess Walter goes on to say, so this could be the explanation as to why so many teachers teach different things. In other words, the Alexander technique of the 1920s would be very different to the technique of the 1950s. So, Richard, what's your takeaway from that paragraph?
Well, I have a few stories. The first one basically was when I was on my own training course. It was the first term, and I went to a Christmas party at the training course, and there was a person who was the husband of one of the trainees. And I got talking to them, and I said to him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm into computers." And then he asked me what I did, and I said, "Well, I've just started the Alexander Technique training." And he took a step back and he said, "Oh, you don't look like an Alexander's Technique student." So I said to him, what does an Alexander Technique student look like? And he just bristled up. He really went stiff, and he said they look like they're riding a bicycle without a saddle. And I at that moment, I decided I never want to look like an Alexander student or a teacher for that matter, because there's an element of stiffness around it.
Yeah.
And when I came across this statement in Walter Carrington's book, it really triggered a lot of things in me. That actually, yes, if I'm trying to free my neck, it's another form of doing.
Yeah.
On top of that, I went back to my own training course where I trained in Totnes in Devon a year after I trained, and I was working with a third year student, and I just couldn't get any movement of the head. So I said to her, can you just let me move your head for a little bit? And she said, "Well, I can, but if I do, I'll have to stop directing."
Yeah.
And for me, that is something that people do when they thinking of the neck to be free, head going up, they cause more tension than was there in the first place.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's the form of doing that Alexander was talking about.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Go on. Was there?
yeah, and the third one was, I think you were there as well, in 1988 at the second Congress. Two caretakers, janitors, were overheard each talking in their little office, and one said to the other, "What are all these people? They're very different than the usual conferences we deal with." And the other janitor said, "Well, I don't know what they do, but all I know is they've all got something wrong with their necks."
Yeah. Yeah. That.
And that is, and that is another, and that, from the outside world, that's what people are perceiving,
Exactly.
which is quite worrying, really.
Well, it's extraordinarily worrying given what our profession professes to be all about. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I came to a realization, I guess maybe, 10 years ago, maybe more, that the the standard type of direction that I had been taught when I was training in London in the uh, uh, late 70s and early 80s was typically something like I'm letting my neck be free,
Hmm.
or and then various add-ons to that perhaps. And typically, the emphasis was on that word let. That's the key word. You're just going to let it be free. And that sounded like a great idea. And I used it in my own teaching to some useful effect, I think. But there came a point when I was doing some self experimentation, and I realized that for someone to say I'm letting my neck be free, and for that to be a useful direction, they would have to know how to let their neck be free. And
Hmm.
in fact, it's very unlikely that they will know how to do it. So there will be a subtle bit of trying, a little efforting creeping in. And
I wouldn't
yeah,
I
go
wouldn't
ahead.
say it's a little bit. Sometimes it's quite a lot.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it
Yeah.
varies, but
Yeah.
um, it's definitely there.
Hmm.
And the what really I think triggered that self-investigation in me was reading Missy Vineyard's book, where she brought used talked about what are often now called negative directions. So a negative neck direction could be I'm not tensing my neck, I'm not tightening my neck, or one of my new favorites, I'm not constricting my neck. They're negative statements grammatically, but of course, operationally, they're quite positive. And the advantage of a statement like that is that it's not making any assumptions that aren't realistic. You know what the word no means. You certainly know how to tense your neck, and you're just saying no to it. It's kind of I think sometimes these are called inhibitory directions. There are various terms for them. And they were in my view, a huge, huge improvement over I'm letting my neck be free, or even worse, I am freeing my neck. Even less likely that anyone could do that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's kind of my in entry into it, and then more recently, the development of freedom directions from Jennifer Roig Frankoli. I think so. A typical freedom direction might be my neck is free, and you're not saying I'm going to do anything to make it free. You're just saying that's what I want, And it turns out that when you say that, your body does what it can to bring that about without you getting drawn into the weeds of how that's going to happen. So to me, it sounds like a little bit Alexander was working out these kind of things and in a slightly different context, but it would you agree that that was the basic issue he was dealing with? These directions that he was using just weren't working as well as he wanted them to.
Yeah, but then the curiosity comes in. Well, what did he replace them with?
Mm,
If he stopped using "let the neck be free" or "allow the neck to be free," whatever you'd like to call it, it's the same. It's the same thing dressed up.
mm-hmm,
And the first thing that really confused me was in 2004. I went to Budapest to a conference, and Elizabeth Walker was there. She trained with Alexander. She started before the war, but she finished after the war. So she started back in 1946. So she would have been on the training course when he came in and said the statement.
mm-hmm,
So I was saying to her, what did where did Alexander say the neck was? Because there were so many different uh, ideas of where you free your neck,
mm-hmm,
um, that I just wanted to get some clear. Where did Alexander say the neck was? And she said he never told us. He never told us where the neck was. And that, for me, for a long time, I couldn't believe that someone would be on the training course with Alexander and the main order was let the neck be free, that he never explained where the neck was or how to free it.
yeah,
And then when this statement came up, I realized that he wanted to move away from those orders. And as far as I know, the closest thing I can get is what Margaret Goldie used to say to people, because Margaret Goldie was working with Alexander right up until the day he died, almost.
mm-hmm,
She used to say, just think of the shoulder coming to a quiet place. And I'm
mm-hmm,
pretty sure that that's what Alexander started to do. He might have put a hand on the neck, just think of this area here coming to a quiet place.
mm-hmm.
And for me that made more sense because you can't do a quietness. There's nothing you can do to make something quiet.
Right,
It's something you
right,
have to stop. It's something you have to stop doing.
right.
And
Well,
I and
yeah,
I yeah,
yeah,
I tend to use those directions more often now. It doesn't matter whether it's shoulder or back or leg. Just allow some quietness or some peace into that area.
I would even say not even so much allow as ask for. Like allow again does assume that you know how to allow it to happen. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, if you simply request it, you know, there's ease in my neck or something like that, or my neck's in a quiet place, you're just saying what you want. But you are not the one,
Mm.
you're not saying, and I'm going to make it happen. You're just saying, this is what I want, and you're trusting that the various subsystems in your body mind will take care of it, which in fact is what happens if you stay out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose as well, if you're talking about body parts like shoulders or neck or legs, you're still splitting the person up into many different parts.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think maybe it's the mind that has to become quiet,
Right. Well,
or the
yeah.
whole of, or the whole, just the whole of you,
Sure.
the whole
Yeah.
of you come to a place of quietness.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't even, yeah, I would actually go right to the brain itself. My brain is
Hmm.
free, or because I think people think, well, what's going on in the brain is just that there's neurons, neural activity, but there's a lot going on in your brain. There's actually manufacture of cranial fluid. There's a lot happening in your brain. It's not just sitting there purely electrical stuff, although that's important enough. There's actual work happening. So,
Yeah.
but to me, this whole discussion and Alexander's uh, this now famous tea break at Ashley Place, what I think it illustrates, to me, it illustrates two things. One, that Alexander never fully figured out what the best directions would be. I mean, he was frustrated with what he had earlier on. He tried various things. He was always experimenting. And I'm not sure he ever really got to a place where he was totally happy with what the optimal type of direction would be. But the other thing it shows is that the technique is this ongoing process. It's been what 70 years since that tea
Yeah,
break, right? More than
yeah.
70 years. And it would be shocking, really, if we hadn't made some significant progress in the art of self directing during that period. And I think we have. And I think that's, in a way, Alexander's brilliance was creating a structure of a sort that allowed for people to innovate after he died, you know?
Yeah, well, I think this is exactly it, and I think there's so many different ways of teaching the Alexander technique because it depends on which book you go to,
Hmm.
because it is a process that kept on changing right up until the time he died. So
Yes,
I
yes.
think whichever way you come in, whichever book you read, that's the technique that you'll do. So you will have many different ones. But I think it's important for teachers to realize that it is a process and where do I want to come in on that process. In the training course that I run, we have some did some kind of research, and for maybe half an hour I would ask the student to give the very traditional let the neck be free, head to go forward and up, back to lengthen, knees forward and away. And then with the same person, they would change to allowing places to come to a quietness. And without exception, nearly everybody felt that they got more out of the second type of orders. So if there are any Alexander teachers listening to this podcast, all I can suggest you do is get together with a friend or a colleague and just experiment on the traditional orders that you usually use and maybe the ones that were more likely that Margaret Goldie were using, like come to a quiet place, or even maybe even experiment with totally new ones.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I this is going back to your stories about this the Brighton conference in 1988, where the worker there said these people all have something wrong with their necks. I had the
Hmm.
experience when I was in England. I was at the near the end of my training course, and I was on a residential workshop in a totally different topic in Scotland. And this lady said to me, "You look like not so much someone who's relaxed, but a statue of someone who's relaxed." And I
Hmm.
thought, what does that mean? I had no idea what she was talking about, but I think now I do know what she was talking about. And I think it
Yeah,
was that little bit of that little or sometimes a lot of stiffness that creeps into using those earlier directions. So
yeah, yeah,
is yeah, go ahead.
yeah. There was another story that I had. There was a teacher who was on the radio talking about Alexander's technique and releasing tension and all the rest of it. And the interviewer he was in the room with the interviewer, and the interviewer said to him, "You talk about releasing tension, but you look very stiff." So the interviewer had actually picked up on that there was something that wasn't um, connecting
Yeah,
the relaxation, and yet the outward appearance was actually very stiff and starchy. And
yeah.
then in the last story I have is in 2009 in San Francisco in the Amstat AGM. I did a workshop there, and somebody came up afterwards and said, "Thank you, I enjoyed the workshop." And I asked her if she came to these every year, and she said, "Well, I love coming, but I had to stop coming because for 3 weeks after every AGM, I would get chronic neck problems, uh, which which I never got any other time of the year. So I
Oh,
had to stop coming. So there's this kind of feeling that but that's where the doing comes in. That is I'm doing my head forward and up.
mhm.
I'm making something happen,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think it's quite sad, really. I think we're missing the boat if that's going on, if that sort of
I
stuff going on.
do you, here's a sort of a related question that has occurred to me. This sort of what we call maybe dissatisfaction with how classical Alexander directions are working, I think maybe has led to some teachers saying to themselves, maybe the best thing is to ditch directions altogether and just do hands-on work and zap our students, and that'll take care of it. I mean, my first teacher, um, he never talked about directions.
Hmm.
He just did hands-on work, and it was good work. He was a McDonald trained teacher. It was good work, and it sure made a big difference in my functioning. But when I asked him about directions, because I started reading about the technique, he said, "Oh, that's only for very, very advanced students," which obviously I was not. And I think that maybe the problems with directions earlier on has just caused some teachers to dismiss them as being way less important than the hands-on aspect of the technique. Whereas for me personally, I think they are the most important part of the technique. The hands-on certainly can be valuable, but a teacher with amazing hands, Marjorie Barstow, she used them very sparingly. She was interested in getting people to think, and she would use her hands if that facilitated that process, but she was very sparing in how she used her hands.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Well, I think the use of the hands is very important because I think, you see, if you see a 3-year-old child,
hmm,
the direction is already in them, the freedom is already in them.
right.
So we're using our hands to remove what is stopping that freedom and direction from being there. It's innate in every single human being.
Yeah,
And
I
that's what we're
agree.
trying to do. We're not trying to create a direction. That direction is in human beings. And we have to stop doing what we're doing to prevent that freedom and that direction from taking place.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of that. I would say that's sort of the essence of the Alexander technique, teaching people how
Yeah,
to get out of the way of what is there,
yeah,
is potentially available. So is there
exactly.
is there anything else you want to say about on this topic before we come to an end?
No, but I just think it's a really important area of the technique to investigate. And I have a feeling that the Alexander technique isn't as popular now as it was in the 70s or 80s. And I think partly because people can smell a rat. So when Alexander teaches, they're giving their directions and they look a little stiff. People think, I don't want to look like that. But they do want to be looking like graceful. They do want to be looking free.
Hmm.
They do want to be looking relaxed. I think people are moving on. I think we do need to embrace what's going on with people, and if we're ever to make the technique more accessible to a wider audience.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything you just said. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation. Um,
Yeah. Just
yep.
one last thing
Sure.
before you go. I just realized while we're talking that most of my books have actually got the traditional Alexander directions in there. So I've got a lot of rewriting to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're all in that boat.
Yeah.
I remember when I first went on the training course with this not knowing any directions, and someone asked about a direction, and there were like multiple answers. And I noticed that when I was in England, when I would ask what forward and up meant, for example, I had at one
Mhm.
point a list of five different contradictory descriptions of it. And I think there was
Mhm.
just a lot of confusion about directions at that period of time, as there is, I suppose, now as well. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
uh,
I totally agree.
so my guest today has been Richard Brennan, who's an Alexander Technique teacher, author, and he's the director of training at the Alexander Technique Center in Galway, Ireland. I'll be putting a link next by this interview to his website. I'll also have a link to a website where you can find learn more about the Alexander Technique and find a teacher anywhere in the world. So, Richard, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, you're welcome, Robert. Thank you.